Hello everyone, my name is Eric Schultz. I am Assistant Professor of Music and Woodwinds at Coastal Carolina University, which is just a few minutes out of Myrtle Beach here in South Carolina. And I'm very excited to talk to you today about my favorite topic for the Woodwinds, which is articulation. I hope you enjoyed that performance of Hora Staccato, usually heard on the violin. As clarinetists, it's interesting that we haven't put more attention into having an arsenal of articulation techniques ready for any situation. We are quick to sing the praises of the clarinet, which are, the tone quality, the vocal tone quality, and the legato, and our ability to slur like no other instrument. And those are strengths, of course, but we also have to be honest about the weaknesses of the instrument, which, let's face it, it's the articulation, So when you get to an excerpt like, if you're playing in the orchestra, Bartered Bride Overture, you have to figure something out. There's no way to get through an excerpt like this and tongue everything that's meant as having you tongue. There's just no way to do it. So let's listen in. Now, compared to the strings, the articulation for the woodwinds is in the mouth. So this is hard to, of course, see what's going on. Oftentimes, as a teacher, this is the hardest thing to teach because you can't see what's going on. We can hear what's going on very often, but we can't see, which is a disadvantage also for us in teaching articulation. With the string instruments, everything's right here, can be visually observed. With the piano, everything's in front of us, you can see. And that helps students to understand what we're talking about as well. With the clarinet, the saxophone, the flute, when we're talking about articulation with a student, oftentimes students think they're doing something with the tongue, but they're not. And there's no way to actually verify that. I'm holding out for that iPhone attachment that you can see inside of the mouth. But until then, and when you look at further the string articulations available, besides staccato, it's there's a whole other arsenal that the string instruments have developed. So why shouldn't we have that as a woodwind instrument? Why aren't we talking in these terms? That's my thesis of this presentation. so without further ado, let's talk about how to actually do this. In terms of articulation, we have, of course, the textbook way we teach articulation today, which is that the tip of the tongue comes to the tip of the reed, you know? So here's the reed, the tongue comes up and touches on the tip. You know, I find very few people actually do this, but this is the way we teach it. The edge of the reed is sharp, so you find most professionals even are tonguing slightly below the tip, and some are even quite low on the reed. You know, as long as that's not causing any problems in terms of percussive effects all the time on the reed, it's fine to be tonguing lower on the reed as well. In terms of multiple articulation, you know, when we're talking about the flute, there's just infinite resources on how to learn how to do this for the flute, and that's an advantage for the flute in terms of learning this technique, and even from a young age. I have middle school students who have learned how to do this, and it's just not tricky on the flute. The gist of the idea is that you still have the front articulation on the reed, but in the rebound, there's an articulation on the hard palate. All right, so what that does is it gives us an advantage, you know. When you think of the violin, they get a note each direction. With the clarinet, we have to move the tongue twice to get one note. Ta, back, ta, back, ta, back. So this fixes that ratio. Now we're getting a note per movement instead of a note per two movements. Ta, 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 or ta, ka, all right? So there are different syllables people will use for this. I like dugga. I find it's lighter. Some advocate for tiki to get the tongue higher. It depends on the person, I think. But you know, the gist of the idea here is that theoretically you can double your articulation speed because you're getting that articulation in a rebound. So on the clarinet, instead of single tonguing, now if you allow the back of the tongue to touch the hard palate lightly, you can go much faster, and it's not tiring. You know, the endurance is better as well. Now with the flute, there are advantages to the flute beyond just the increased resources and the longer history of the instrument. The flute is just uses the tongue in a different way. So with the clarinet, we have this front of the tongue use, the articulation use of the tongue, and with the clarinet and saxophone, there's also the back of the tongue, which is where we voice. The back of the tongue is high to get the airstream fast. With the flute, we don't do that. The tongue is relaxed. So the tongue is not being used in the front and back differently. So it allows us, I think, more relaxation with the tongue. You know, the tongue can be more relaxed. And so even in an excerpt like this, the Mendelssohn Scherzo, even in the high register, relatively high register like this, it's no problem. You know, even for a young flutist. And with the flute, that is completely effortless, even in the upper register, because there's not that voicing in the back of the tongue, right? Everything's very relaxed, so it allows the tongue to move in the front and the back without affecting pitch as it does with the clarinet. For the clarinetist, there's this voicing in the back of the tongue responsible for pitch, especially in the upper register. As you're playing in the upper register, the tongue gets higher, and the pitch becomes more flexible. So any movement at the back of the tongue, you'll hear it in the pitch, especially in the upper register. With the flute, there's just not this problem. So you can use this multiple articulation all the way up to, you know, high C and beyond. It's no problem. On the clarinet, we have to really practice so that it's very light back there, barely moving. With the clarinet, we're able to get all of that pitch bend because of voicing. There's a tiny trombone in every note, especially in the upper register. With the flute, moving your tongue like that doesn't affect the pitch. As much as it does on the clarinet. not even close. Of course, we can move the pitch, it's just done externally. There, in terms of rolling in, rolling out. Something interesting about this technique when comparing the different instruments is on the flute, of course, it's just a standard technique. Students from a young age will learn how to do this, and it's just not a problem. On the clarinet, it gets a different, there's a different connotation to it. It's seen as kind of a virtuosic extended technique, not necessary, despite all of the orchestra and all of our solo repertoire that really for most people will require these techniques if you're not going to add slurs. And so the question eventually becomes, as you do learn the technique, because anybody can learn how to do this. It's not a virtuosic technique. And it's not a new technique either. As clarinetists, we've just not done a good job over time of documenting the use of this technique. Contrast that with the saxophone, who saxophonists over the past 100 years have a long documented history of using this technique and writing about it. Remember, in the 20s and 30s, saxophonists and doublers were mainly jazz musicians, and jazz musicians were celebrities because jazz music was the popular music of the time. So you can see here in this list of resources written by saxophonists, we have a lot of 1920s. And then for clarinet, for the clarinet here, you see a little bit later, and they're writing about it in a different way. And we'll talk about that. I would add to this also Johann Bachhofen's 1802 treatise about the clarinet, which includes some discussion about articulation in ways that we would consider unconventional today. For example, tonguing with the throat, or the lips, or a guttural kind of articulation, which we generally try to stay away from today. There are other ways to articulate faster on the clarinet and saxophone that I don't think have really been explored, have been explored enough. And this has been described by several clarinetists, going back to Keith Stein. It's described in David Pino's book, The Clarinet and Clarinet Playing. And in my discussions with John Brussier, he has used this technique. So this on the reed style of multiple articulation, instead of tonguing at the front and back, it eliminates the voicing problem that can happen in the back by tonguing on the reed. Back and forth. Instead of ta, 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 we have this kind of motion. So it's also fixing that ratio issue. Every movement we're getting a note. That is described, and also up and down. Ta, 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 instead of ta, ta, ta. This is an interesting technique, and again, theoretically it would eliminate those voicing issues. So if you're tonguing in the upper register of the clarinet for something like Bartok contrast, the cadenza, you could use this technique theoretically and tongue up in the high G sharp A area with this technique and not have any issues with pitch. Although I will say today, I think if you practice conventional double tonguing enough, this pitch issue becomes a non-issue if you practice enough. So having said that, it's still an interesting technique, and it involves less motion, so it's intriguing. So one other thing we can do after we learn this technique, I think, is as a clarinetist or saxophonist, we can finally play all these encore pieces that string players do. So just have fun with it, String players have been doing these pieces for centuries, and they're just fun to play. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. So thank you.